So first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to take part in this, Russ. I really appreciate it. I know that it's a very busy time for all the candidates, and
Yes.
I really appreciate you helping to make this happen. Your video calling in, people will notice. What are your travels during the general election time looking like? Are you quite busy, quite often?
Well, of course, when Rishi Sunak announced the date of the election, which was a surprise to lots of people, I think, those of us who are continuing to work and try and do the campaign have had to do a fair amount of juggling. So I'm speaking to you from London. I'm actually working in London at the moment, I'm happy to be able to finally catch up with you. I'm sorry to have been elusive, but it's a balancing act to make sure that I can do everything and do the best job possible as the candidate.
Yeah, well, I completely understand that. Normally, we've done this once before. This would be done from a studio in Canterbury we used last time, but everything happened so quickly that it's turned into a kitchen podcast, which is why so I completely understand the situation that it's put a lot of us in. Let's find out a bit more about Russ Timpson then. Tell me, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about you, a little bit about Canterbury, and then about national issues. So about you, I think what often paints a really good picture for people of what somebody's like is what their upbringing was like and how they describe their upbringing. So where were you born and bred, as they say?
Okay. So my whole family is steeped in service in the Royal Navy. And in my early years, I grew up down in Portsmouth, and my dad was in the Navy. He finished his time in the Navy, and I moved up to Kent when I was about 10 years old, and pretty much grew up in the village of Wickenbrew, just outside of Canterbury. Going to school in Canterbury, I went to the Geoffrey Chaucer School, as it was, when I moved up from Hampshire. And I did all my schooling there, and at the age of 16 decided that I wanted to go off and have the adventures that the rest of my family did. So I joined the Royal Navy at the age of 16 and went off to the Navy down to Plymouth eventually. As you do when you join the military, you don't always know where you're going to end up. And I ended up serving in the submarine service.
Oh, right. Okay.
I served my time in both nuclear hunter-killer submarines, and then I ended up on the oldest diesel submarine we had in the fleet during my time.
So that's really interesting. I mean, I guess at some point in our conversation, we should make sure that we make space for talking about defence and military spending. Then it's obviously something which you'll not only be close to your heart, but I'm sure you'll have a lot of knowledge on. So do you think that, how would you describe your core values? And do you think that things like your military experience and your politics and your upbringing, how did they affect your core values, and what are they? What makes you who you are in that way?
Well, when you're in the military, it's not always easy to be actively political, and certainly my family was not actively political. But I felt that when I left the military, it was incumbent upon me to at least vote in a way that I thought would follow my what I believed in. And so I looked objectively at all the main political parties. In fact, I actually went to their meetings because I had a completely open mind, and I went to all of them. And without doubt, when I sat down with the people from the Liberal Democrats, they were just people I felt were on the same wavelength as me.
In what way? So what of your core principles did you share with the Liberal Democrats as a party?
Well, I believe in the right of the individual to live the most liberated life they can and be the best person they can, the rights of the individual is important to me. Now, clearly, that has to be set within a framework of responsibility in a community. But I felt that was the core tenet of being a liberal is to respect individuality, tempered with tolerance, and allowing people to lead their lives the way they want to lead them. And when you're confronted with a policy issue, look for the evidence to back up what would be, the approach to that. For me, would always be an evidence-based approach, not necessarily led by dogma or political ideology to the extent that you dogmatically follow one route, as it were. And I would hope that it also comes across in a sort of caring and responsible way as well, looking after each other, sense of community, and then having reasonably high principles about behaviour and the way you do things. And above all, I suppose, given all the things that have gone on in the last few years, a strong sense of decency and being able to do responsible things.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's a really nice kind of I guess picture of what if you were creating an ideal world, everything would look like, and I think that sounds like a pretty nice picture. Okay, so this question I'm going to ask to everyone, and obviously for some of the candidates it's going to have a kind of a different sense and a different meaning. If you did become the MP for Canterbury, what would the effect of the job be on your life, on your family, on your friends, on you? We're hearing a lot at the moment about the impact that this job can actually have on MPs. Do you have a support network, for example? What are your thoughts around that?
Okay, so I've got 3 grown-up children who are not dependent on me anymore. I've got 3 grandchildren, and pleased to say another one on the way. So I'm able now to devote time and that I probably didn't have before when I was sort of obviously being an active dad as I was. For me, it would be a huge privilege to be trusted with this. I would look forward to doing it slightly differently than I think some MPs. I've had great privilege of being spoken to and mentored by some great politicians. For example, Paddy Ashdown. I got to know Paddy Ashdown pretty well, and the way he conducted himself. And I think it's really incumbent upon the MPs, because you have to work in the levels of democracy in our community. The Canterbury City Council has to do their job, and then the parish councils around the area, they do their job. And I think it's incumbent upon the MP to work. If you could work as a team. Now, all of my life, I went from the Royal Navy into the fire service. I served as a firefighter in Kent Fire Brigade. So I've got kind of teamwork and working with people in my bones, as it were, and I work best. And I would want to approach it from that format, where working with Canterbury City Council, with how I could help them and the role that I would need to play to tackle some of the big issues in Canterbury, which, I'm sure your listeners...
Well, for sure. I mean, we're the Canterbury Residents Group is always a hive of activity of people talking about them, what they think are the, are the things that need fixing in Canterbury and need sorting in Canterbury. So let's move on to talking about Canterbury, the greatest city in the world. I think you'll agree. I think there's a lot of community. There's a lot of people in Canterbury that very much care for their city. But there's also a lot of people with a differing opinion of what the most pressing issue is facing a city like Canterbury. So in your mind, if you had to sum up your most pressing issue that perhaps you would pen a letter to the council about to try and work together on fixing, what would it be?
I think Canterbury, like lots of other towns and cities in Kent, can be perceived as being in decline. Certainly, if you go to Dover or Sittingbourne, the city centre experience is not one necessarily of a sort of a vibrant community or city centre. I think Canterbury, whilst there are obviously good parts of that, I think, if I remember it back when I was when there used to be people driving through the centre of Canterbury, that shows my age.
So when the A2 ran down the high street, as it were.
Down the high street, and the biggest shop in Canterbury was Woolworths, and everybody went to Woolworths to buy their records and stuff. I can remember that far. Certainly, there's a perception that the city centre has to some degree declined. I think there's been perhaps some unwise development in Canterbury in the past. So I think that's
what is there any particular unwise developments that you're thinking about when you say that?
Yeah, I think the Whitefriars development. Looking back at Whitefriars and the impact that's had on the high street, and now we're seeing obviously with the departure of the big anchor stores like Debenhams and Nason's in Canterbury, which stood empty. Now, if you're a tourist or somebody walking down Canterbury High Street and you see, lots of different shops not boarded up, but they're certainly not in use. It tends to give an air of dilapidation. I think there should be some creative energy put into addressing that and tackling it. Obviously, business rates and other things are a block to some people and certainly, and that's a matter for Canterbury City Council. But I think I would want to work with them to try and be the representative of Canterbury in the House of Commons, saying, all the great things that we want for Canterbury, and then obviously raising questions and pursuing those agendas in the House of Commons on behalf of Canterbury.
Sure. So, we're gonna come on to national issues later, and I'm going to ask you about what you think the most pressing national issue is as well. There's obviously a lot of crossover between national issues and local issues. So when asking people about what local issues they wanted to hear their candidates talking about, what came up most often is really one that is hand in hand with national policy, and that's NHS. So yes. I mean, first of all, a lot of people wanted to know fairly straightforwardly from each candidate, will they be campaigning and supporting an A&E in Canterbury?
Okay, so just to give you some context, my wife was a nurse. My wife's sister is a nurse. 2 of my children were born in Canterbury Hospital. In fact, I did a fundraising thing to buy a birthing pool for Canterbury because my second son was born there. So I've got a huge attachment to the hospital itself. I think it's bizarre that if you have an accident, you've either got to go to QEQM or you've got to go to the William Harvey in Ashford. I think for people in Canterbury, where there's been a long-standing hospital there for as long as I can remember, to say that there is no facility for A&E is bizarre. I would say, though, that A&E is being used as a cure-all for all matters. And if you phone 111, by and large, they will say go to A&E. And I think one of the strong policies that the Lib Dems are pushing forward is to tackle that front door to the NHS via the recruitment of more GPs and making them more available. Yeah. Because I think that there are perhaps people going to A&E who don't need to go to A&E and who are causing the congestion which is forcing these issues. But
not through their own choice. They haven't got access. I mean, so yeah, so the Lib Dems have said, is it 6,000, 7,000 new GPs into the system? It's quite 8,000. It's a serious number. Other similar promises have been made by other parties like this over the years. Is a promise like that feasible? I mean, what's the kind of the timescale for training a GP these days? If you've got to have people entering in as trainees, they're not going to be coming out trained for a long time, are they?
We should be training a lot more doctors. I mean, migration is often raised in this, but we've got a huge problem with the brain drain of doctors and nurses, radiographers, etc., who are leaving the UK because of their terms and conditions and their lifestyle, etc., and they're going to places like Australia and New Zealand and Canada. That has to be tackled. There's a reason they're leaving in droves, is because they can get a better standard of life, and we have to address that issue.
So a lot of these GPs will come, will essentially be found by means of encouraging current training GPs to stay in this country. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we have to stop. We have to try and address why people are leaving. Trained people from the NHS are leaving this country, and all we've seen is strike upon strike. And it really amazes me that we spent, the latter stages of COVID banging saucepans at our states, showing our support for key workers, and then we've now had 2 years where we told them we can't give them a fair pay rise, in line with inflation caused by, all the drastic errors that went on under the Tory government. So I think, we do have to address the terms and conditions for people in the NHS, encouraging them to stay here, but certainly we have to pay more. And actually, I think it's a scandal, personally, that we're going into other countries and recruiting their doctors and nurses and then bringing them here to the UK, stripping out from other countries.
So it's there's a two birds, one stone approach then with this idea that we can bolster the NHS and increase the viability of the service. Is there any? Are you ever convinced by arguments of privatisation for the NHS?
No, I'm not. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the NHS, we do need, the elephant in the room here is that when the NHS was originally devised, it was a safety net for working class people. And in the years that have gone by, it's now turned into, the expectation on the NHS is massive. We all want the NHS available to do everything 24/7. And that's a huge challenge. Certainly, I would not want any aspect of privatisation coming into the NHS, but I think we do need to have a Royal Commission. This is not Liberal Democrat policy. I do think we need a Royal Commission on what's the future of the NHS. How do we address the issue of health in this country, in stopping people getting ill in the first place? We have an epidemic of, type 2 diabetes, for example.
Yeah.
And the NHS is not there to address that. That should be part of the social welfare programme that goes hand in hand with some of these.
Well, yeah, and, the second most asked for kind of position of the candidates is around things like homelessness and food banks. In fact, when I asked this question in the group, it was Canterbury Food Bank that commented, saying, can you ask the candidates what they plan to do to tackle homelessness and food banks? And I guess that ties in with what you're saying about this kind of, the social care system, the system that is a safety net for people, that catches people. What are your thoughts around how to tackle homelessness and the very high use of food banks at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, who would have thought that, what are we? Depends who you ask, whether we're the 6th or 7th biggest economy in the world by gross domestic product, and the fact that we've got, as we have patently got, homeless people on the streets of Canterbury. I think for me, our strapline in this election is fairness, and I think we've got an unfair society at the moment, in that we are paying massive amounts of tax, and I don't think necessarily we're being served well by that. And certainly the level of welfare and social provision that's available to ordinary people is not where it should be. And after we've had many, many years of austerity, and we've had now many years of local authorities being absolutely stripped to the bone of funding and resourcing, lots and lots of services have just stopped to happen, and we've got ourselves into a situation. So we do need, we do need to reinstitute some of those, and that's going to cost money. I think it's scandalous that there are food banks, and working people are having to rely on food banks to have a balanced diet during the week. It's just...
Yeah, we visited one recently as part of this podcast. We visited Canterbury Food Bank and had a tour. And whilst it's an amazing service that the volunteers there offer, and you can't help but feel heartened and warmed by that community project, like you say, it's devastating that it has to be there. So, do you think that you mentioned council budgets? Obviously, as an MP, you have very little to say about the the very little opportunity to interact with the day-to-day running of the council, but you can certainly pressure the government to do what the council needs. You think budgets are the problem with councils? That's where we're being let down by things. It's budget.
Going to first principles, I mean, what's the difference between the Liberal Democrats and the Tories, for example? The Tories are fundamentally a sort of Darwinist party that believes that the strong lead and the strong thrive, and trickle down economics. That if we're doing well, then the less well off will get looked after by the system and moving forward. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think that we have to be a vibrant economy with a well thought through industrial strategy. But then when that money is generated, that money has to be spent in a way that is fair to all, and we don't leave people behind. And I think that's the thing with the difference between us and certainly the Tories is the fundamental ideology where a lot of things are set up to benefit a very few small people. So let me give you an example. The massive bonuses and dividends that have been paid out to investors in the water industry is scandalous. We've hollowed out a lot of our national assets so that some small individuals and groups can make colossal returns on their investment. And I just strongly believe that's wrong. They should be, like we're saying, elements of infrastructure should be set up for the public good. They should return that money.
So you are talking about nationalisation of which industries, if you are talking about that?
Yeah, and I think sometimes, people of my age start to think about the bad old days of things like British Rail and some of the other things. I think, in a modern progressive society, we can set up organisations so that they are set up for the public good. I mean, a water company, I'm a businessman. I've built 2 businesses from the ground up, so I know my way around a successful business. A water company is an absolute nailed-on success of a business. You've got an existing customer base who are paying money for a commodity that they've got to have. That is, by any measure, should be generating good revenue to reinvest, not pay huge bonuses to people who've underperformed and filled our seas and rivers with sewage.
So, sewage is something which comes up regularly on the Facebook group and also, sadly, on the coastline in Whitstable, which would obviously be part of your constituency. Have you been following the campaigns of the Whitstable surfers, for example, against sewage? And is that something you're particularly passionate about?
Yes, they invited me to one of their meetings. Unfortunately, I couldn't go to it, the SOS meeting. I'm a sea kayaker. One of my hobbies is sea kayaking. So I have kayaked all around the coast of Kent, Remargate. And in fact, I've kayaked all the way through past Sheppey. So the sea is, and obviously I was in the Navy, so the sea is very important to me. And it is scandalous that the companies have been allowed to perform in the way that they have and still pay dividends and still pay huge bonuses to their boards, etc. It's a rigged system, and I think it needs to change.
Sure. Okay. Still on Canterbury, let's talk about Brexit, but let's think about what the effects on Canterbury have been. So, for example, tourism on Canterbury and things like that. What were you during the Brexit? Were you a Remain or were you a Leave? And have you changed your mind?
Let's again. This is a clear demarcation between us and the other parties. We are unapologetically internationalist in our outlook. Okay, I'm a consulting engineer. I travel all around the world doing what I do, all continents. And I've learned over the years that every country I've been to, most people are trying to do the same things, bring up a family, do the right things by their kids, etc. And I thought Brexit, it was a democratic decision. I think it was a mistake. I think people were told lots of things which were inaccurate. And it smacks of what you're hearing now from people like the Reform Party, where I call it fag packet politics, where they're making up. They've got one thing they want to say, which is immigration is a problem, and then the rest of it they're making it up as they go along. And I think it would be a disaster if they were allowed to give any more influence. But putting that to one side, because they need to do what they need to do. For me, Brexit, I would want to, if I was in the House of Commons, I'd be making a case for plotting a path back to a stronger relationship with Europe. Now, be the single market, which we're saying we want to go back into. I think we have to find a way back to make friends with our nearest neighbours and reopen those business corridors so that we can start trading with them again. I mean, I speak to people across Europe all the time, people I work with in my job, and they're in disbelief that we've ended up doing what we're doing, and in some cases really, really upset that we've left, because they felt Europe was a much stronger, the EU was a much stronger entity with the UK inside of it, and of course the opposite now. Now, I don't think it's any coincidence, for example, that the division that's being sowed by others around the world, in that Europe, when we left, by any measure, was deemed to be not as strong as it was beforehand. So, those people around the world who want to exploit those kind of things can do. So, to answer your question in a Canterbury context, I think Canterbury has to be the magnet tourist hub when you cross the Channel. Now, hopefully, we're going to reopen Manston Airport in the very near future. We've got potentially a major tourist attraction going in the north of Kent.
So you'd like, I mean, I know it's not on your patch, but you'd like to see Manston Airport reopened to all kinds of flights, and you think, I mean, that your thinking is that will have a knock-on beneficial effect for Canterbury.
Absolutely. If we get Manston Airport open, we've got cruise ships going into Dover now. They're looking to come into a vibrant, historical, iconic city, which Canterbury is. And I think with the right business plan, Canterbury could become a significant, even better tourist hub than it is already. And that's with an emerging tourist people coming from different places than they probably came from in the past, and with good transport facilities, I think that could be a major cash injection into the city.
Another big economy driver for Canterbury is the universities, obviously.
Yes.
The University of Kent, the tagline used to be the European University. I believe they've changed it now because of the impact of Brexit, meaning that they can no longer really justify calling themselves that. Higher education, universities, obviously, I don't know how long you've been a Liberal Democrat for, or whether or not, what your views on it, but do you think there is still a sense of mistrust from students towards the Liberal Democrats, or do you think that's faded? And, what are your promises to those in education in Canterbury, which obviously make up, a surprisingly large number of the voters here?
Yeah, I think it's regrettable when we are taken to task on an issue that took place some time ago. If we compared that with some of the things that have gone on with the other parties, and it seems to be the only thing that's ever brought up was tuition fees, which was developed by the other parties and increased by the other parties, and we had to swallow a lot in coalition to get the increase in the personal tax threshold to bring a lot of people out of tax. So would I have changed it? Would I have done that again if I possibly? Yeah, of course. I think I went to university as a mature student, and it changed my life. I think university is a fantastic thing. Clearly, the universities, Canterbury is a university town now, and it relies heavily on all of that comes with it. I am concerned that the universities have become reliant now on foreign students to come in and fill the coffers of the university, and some of them have got slightly carried away, I think, with the funding model, and have now I think Kent University has certainly got a deficit that it needs to service, etc., etc. So I suppose if you were asking me, would I change how things panned out beforehand? Yes, of course I would. But we were in coalition with the Tories, and I don't see us ever in my lifetime getting back into a coalition with the Tories, because they were, we did it for the right reasons, but be careful when you dance with the devil, is what I would say.
You mentioned the universities, and not just Canterbury's universities, but universities across the UK struggling with their finances. One of the ways in which the University of Kent is exploring to generate income is land development. It's another pressing issue, I think, for a lot of Canterbury residents. The local plan is obviously something which is drawn up by the council, but something which I think, the MP for Canterbury can certainly represent the voices through that process. So what's your view on development in Canterbury, housing targets, and areas that people are very, some people are very upset to see certain areas of Canterbury developed on?
Well, my approach to this, I'm a big fan of the Canadian model that says that if your population is going to grow by a certain percentage, then you have to put in the infrastructure before that population grows. So we were talking about Canterbury Hospital earlier on. Now, I think it's ludicrous and frankly reckless to build new large housing developments as an adjunct to Canterbury when we don't have the commensurate infrastructure in hospitals, healthcare, roads, schools, etc., etc. I think you have to do that first, but you have to do it with the community consent, and you have to listen to people. Now, we put forward a policy of 10 new garden cities in the UK to help tackle some of these particular issues. So we're not against building per se, but I think it has to be done. Sustainability has to be part of the discussion, because simply, adhering to the government figures, and let's just unpack this a bit. This goes back again in ideology terms. It was the Thatcher government that introduced the right to buy scheme that removed a huge tranche of social housing out of the UK housing stock. And so we largely don't have I don't know what the waiting list is now in Canterbury. I saw some figures the other day. It's 2.5 years waiting list to get into a social housing. So, yeah. So what I'm saying is that's the legacy that we've inherited, which is basically sell off the family silver in terms of social housing. To tackle that now, we do need to build new housing. But we have to tackle the sustainability question. It is simply no good building houses if you don't build the commensurate sustainable stuff to go with it. And if you're going to build on an area of obvious natural importance, that has to be done through consent with the local community. And I went to the hustings in Whitstable where there were people there, and I simply don't think you've got the support of the local community in relation to some of the development. I
guess the argument is that that you're sure that's all well and good, and I think that for you clearly need to get the consent of the community to take them along on a development project. But the need at the moment, the crisis, is so severe. When we had COVID, we were able to make adjustments to the way things were done in order to progress fast enough to get ahead of whatever it was, or that was the plan at least. With housing, I think that there's a lot of accusations from some people in Canterbury that there's a lot of NIMBYism that goes on in Canterbury. Would you agree with that or not?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, most people don't want where they live potentially built upon until there's a debate and a discussion and you talk about the adequate need. Now, if it wasn't housing, if it was a school, then they might think differently about it. I certainly think that we have not exhausted the building on brownfield sites. I'm an engineer. I work in the construction industry, And I can tell you now that there's a lot of office buildings now being converted into residential as an example of one of the ways that we can tackle this quite quickly. I am also surprised that we're not doing a national audit on empty houses around the country, properties that remain second properties, etc., that remain empty. I think there should be some creative thought about how we bring those back into use, and they're used more beneficially for the local community. I think it's crazy that we have people in tents in Canterbury, living in tents down by the old by the bus station there, when there are many. It appears to me there are empty homes sitting around that are not being used. I just think that's wrong.
Final sort of really Canterbury focused question, and then we'll quickly rifle through some national issues. Private schools. We have a very famous large private school in Canterbury, the King's School. There are lots of private schools dotted around the city and the outskirts. Some people on the residents group are worried that the proposed tax hike will force a lot of parents to withdraw their children from private schools and put them into mainstream education, thereby worsening the pressure on mainstream education, especially SEN. What's your view on tax, on VAT on private schools and the impact it could have?
Okay, so it's not Liberal Democrat policy. Certainly you're talking about the Labour policy to put VAT on school fees. I think that I was surprised to see recently in a report that the number of people registering for private schools is going up, and the number of new private schools is actually increased in the last 12 months. And I think the Labour
it's a good thing.
Has been. I have to tell you that my daughter went to a private school in Canterbury for a couple of years when she was having some issues. So it would be wrong for me to say. I think that if you want to spend your money sending your child to a private school, you should have the right to do that.
This is the liberal core principle in that you mentioned earlier coming out.
If you want to spend your money sending your child to a school, then you should have the right to do that and spend your money in the way that you want to do it.
But you're not you don't agree with Labour's plan to tax it, or at least it's it's not in your manifesto. But do you agree with that?
I think that private schools are a business, and they should be treated as such.
So they should pay VAT. Customers should pay VAT.
They're a business. They're there to, in most cases, make a profit.
Sure. Okay, that's the private schools question answered. Let's move on to some national issues. We've got about 10-15 minutes to go. So there's a lot of national issues. Again, there's always going to be crossovers with local issues, but let's imagine the scenario that you've been elected as MP and you are making your maiden speech. What is the first, aside from a Canterbury related issue, which I'm sure would be the very first thing you mentioned, but your first national issue that you would raise in Parliament as an MP?
Sustainability. As I alluded to earlier on, it's a massive issue for me that we need to tackle the sustainability. For far too long, we've been under progressive Labour and Tory governments. We've been lurching from sort of crisis to crisis. And I think we need to stop and take stock and make ourselves much more resilient as a country. So if you take the energy crisis, for example, where we've become reliant on cheap fuel from Russia and other cheap sources so that, so the profits can be made, etc., instead of thinking, actually, what does this do in the medium to long term? So, of course, we're going to say that we believe in renewables. I do believe in renewables. The building of the Thanet wind farm and the growth of the solar industry. I understand that we've got the UK's largest battery farm now is going in Richborough, in Thanet, for example. So I would say sustainability, and I would like to have a national conversation about how we make ourselves less susceptible to crisis events. Like a housing crisis. What sort of housing are we going to need? Are we going to need much more dense housing in terms of high rise and things like that in cities to accommodate the people that we need to accommodate? Farming, etc. And our food, our dependency now on imports and exports of food. We can no longer, as a country, feed ourselves. So how do we address that? So what I'm trying to get across here is, I think sustainability for the medium and long term, we have to then invest in national infrastructure to get ourselves into a better position, because I think if you have austerity and you have the capitalist agenda, which is extract as much money out of as you can. I mean, it's no doubt in business, one of a business tactic that you may adopt is what I call sweating the asset. So you run it until it's completely on its knees, because that's the profitable way to do it. And, that's largely the sort of the approach that's been followed by certain governments in line with what they're trying to achieve, which is making rich people a lot richer. And so my maiden speech will be about that. It would be about how do we make this country more sustainable, combined with how do we make it fairer? How do we make key workers, as we called them, how do we reflect that in their pay packets, and make them the key people they are, and give them some self-respect with a decent wage.
So you've made your maiden speech, and it's time to make a vote about something. This is a whipped vote, and you're going to be asked by your party's leader to vote a certain way. How do you feel about whipped votes? How do you feel about their impact on the way that the parliamentary system works? A lot of people asking if something wasn't right for Canterbury, but you were being asked to vote for it, for example, how do you feel about all of that?
I think if you're elected as an MP, you represent the people in that constituency, and I would struggle if I was being whipped on a policy that would have a detrimental effect on Canterbury. I would find it almost impossible to comply with that.
So yeah, not a fan of doing something to the detriment of Canterbury. I think that's the answer that people would want to hear. A national issue, because of the number one reason that the police give for the lack of resources and at least the perceived ability of the police to actually do their job in Canterbury, in Canterbury Residents Group, because on social media people are often talking about crime. They're often talking about what they consider to be a poor response from the police, and they're also very understanding that if the police don't have the funding to do their job, where do you stand on funding of police? Are you a supporter of Kent Police and the work they do?
I've got staggering amount admiration for the police. Now, when I was a firefighter in Kent Fire Brigade, we used to work with them all the time at things like road traffic accidents, and the police would obviously turn up and we'd work together as part of a team. And I know that they are absolutely stretched to breaking point. They're being expected to do their job under huge issues. And, to be a police officer and be asked to go out on patrol in a car on your own, which is something that's happening now, and face the kind of threats and challenges that they're being asked to do. I mean, I've got massive admiration for them. And it's a sign of the times when you see police officers getting out of a car and they look like combat troops as to the environment that they're working in. There is no question that I think we need more police officers. We need more police officers in the community, working with communities, understanding and identifying if we have got county lines type drug activity, coming into the area. the local community knows where the problem is, and I think the issue is they become frustrated when it's not being tackled.
Yeah.
But there is only so much that police officers can do, and it was quite some time ago. I was in the fire service, but I do remember back then going to a road traffic accident. This was down near Folkestone, actually. I was at Folkestone Fire Station, and a police car turning up with a police officer who was a lady. And I said, well, you're going to need backup. And she said, there isn't any. I'm it. South of Ashford, I'm it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we were to really understand how stretched the police were, then I think we'd all agree that we need more resource. So,
is that a manifesto pledge to increase spending on police budgets?
Yeah, we have to have more police, and we have to have more police in the community. Everybody would want that and would ask for that, but we're pulling them in so many different directions that we do need more police officers. I mean, the fact that you phone up the police and you report a crime or you report a concern, and I've heard from, even in my community, people saying, well, the rate of rural crime where I live obviously in a small village just outside Canterbury, but the rate of rural crime and theft and burglary, etc. The only way to tackle that is to put more police officers on out on the street tackling it.
Another big issue globally at the moment that people talk about in Canterbury Residents Group a lot, actually, is the conflict between Gaza and Palestine and their conflict with Israel. What are your views on that conflict?
You can only start talking when you stop firing bullets. I'm of an age. I remember growing up in Northern Ireland where people were being bombed and shot on a daily basis. I remember in South Africa people were being bombed and shot during apartheid. We have resolved, to a large extent, we have resolved those issues. There is only one way to peace, and that is to stop firing bullets.
So you're calling for a ceasefire?
Absolutely.
Okay, so final couple of questions. Are there any points in your manifesto, in your party's manifesto, that you disagree with?
Oh, what a great question. Are there any points in the manifesto that I disagree with?
It's an interesting question. It was suggested by someone on the group, and I definitely picked it because, it's a really interesting question. I guess my follow-up would be if you can't immediately think of any anything on the manifesto you disagree with, how would you deal with working with colleagues that have different views on you to certain things? Are you quite a sort of open-minded to collaboration and to talking issues through?
Well, I think we talk about in politics, we talk about the left and the right, and the parties that align with those are what they are. The Liberal Democrats are firmly in the middle. Now, and some people might be slightly annoyed at being called reasonable, but I think Liberal Democrats are reasonable people. I think we'll listen to evidence-based arguments, and we'll make a decision based on the weight of the evidence and the good and harm that the outcome will give. So I'm certainly open to talking to people. And a bigger issue here, Ed, is the one of division. We've got so much division in our country at the moment. There are people who are promoting their politics through division. And I would want to say to people that I don't disagree with you just because of your party. I want to work with you and I want to find the best outcome for this. So if a colleague came to me and said, look, we really need to follow this because this is going to secure more votes, for example, if we go down this road by opposing this, I would want to have an evidence-based discussion on that and look at it in not only the local, the micro and the macro, and say, what does this mean? What precedent does this set? So, but at the end of that process, if I'm convinced, then I would change my mind. nobody did anything who wasn't capable of changing their mind.
And final question: what's your view on the culture wars? Canterbury Residents Group is a very dynamic group where people talk about lots of different issues, but one that really does come to the fore a lot is what I think can be loosely termed as culture wars. The conversation around trans rights and transgender people, single-sex spaces, etc., merging in with things like what schools are teaching, and it's a very kind of complex, big subject. So I'm going to throw the challenge to you to sum up your views on culture wars in 30 seconds.
Well, the Liberal Democrats believe in personal freedom and tolerance and creating a community and a culture that allows people to be the best people they can be. Now, that's a bit of a soundbite. I grew up in Canterbury in the late 70s when punk. Now, I remember in Canterbury there were a whole diverse collection of people who dressed and acted and behaved in line with their musical thing. Now, I'm not being trivial about this. What I'm saying is that we should accommodate everybody in our community, and they should have the right to live the lifestyle that they want to live, without fear or without acrimony, and celebrating the fact that we're different. I love meeting new cultures and going to different countries and understanding. And I think if you want to try and turn the clock back and taking the UK back to the 1950s, then that's up to you. That's not the community that I want to live in.
Russ, thank you very much for your time and for taking part in the This Is Canterbury podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. Russ Timpson, who is standing to be the MP for Canterbury for the Liberal Democrats. The other candidates are Luke Buchanan-Hodgman from the SDP, Henry Stanton from the Green Party, Louise Harvey-Quirke from the Conservatives, Rosie Duffield from Labour, and Bridget Porter from Reform UK. But Russ Timpson, once again, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your views with the constituency of Canterbury and the people on Canterbury Residents Group.
Thanks for the opportunity.